Aperture.
So thank you for being here, and what I will show, I will not only do at the end I report how I spend the money, but first two parts will be showing you the work which will get me to getting this money, because with Smith, as when the photographer asked me what is Smith, what do you apply for, I explained that Smith is kind of like a mid-career grant, but it doesn't mean you have to be middle-aged. It's about some work which you already put into, and you just need some closing note on a bigger body of work. So I will show you, I specialize in ex-Soviet Union, which is quite a big chunk of the world. I think it makes 1/8 of land on the planet, 15 countries. So it might sound like a small thing, but actually it's a huge territory where Russia is the biggest, but just one of the 14 countries. My first part of work was done in Caucasus. It was a project done about Caucasus, 3 countries and breakaway territories. I will show you a short film from the project. The second, I will show you a second video, which was the project I did after that in Ukraine. I'll tell you a couple words about this, and then I will show you what I did with Smith. The part with Smith was focusing on the Russians living outside of present-day Russia, which stayed there after Soviet Union fall apart. So it covers countries like Latvia, Kazakhstan, now independent, focusing on Russian, but I will tell also about this. So now I'm going to hide behind pre-prepared presentation, 2 short presentation of Caucasus project and Ukrainian one, and then I'll move on. I will talk more when I will show what I did with Smith.
I moved to Tbilisi in 2002 and I began my decade-long documentary project. This was a time the city suffered almost constant power cuts and billboards advertised a kidnapped foreign businessman. But it turned out to be the eve of the new era. In the fall of 2003, the Rose Revolution swept Georgia, sending waves across the former Soviet Union. I was inside the parliament when the opposition burst in and the president, Eduard Shevardnadze, escaped out the side door. It was the first time I had witnessed a major historical event up close and from the inside. I have traveled the region and witnessed a momentous decade up close, from revolutions that have brought hope and change to some and misfortune to others, to the perversion of war which arrived at my door. Life here for me is a voyage to extremes, where even a simple taxi ride can turn out to be a trip down Alice's rabbit hole. However, my desire has been to find the deeper nuances of how individuals have managed to withstand the last 20 turbulent years in the region. My quest is by no means complete, as the Caucasus is a lifelong phenomenon. This book is my story of experiencing life here in Caucasus by virtue of Georgia, where I live. It is the testimony to the infectious intensity and beauty of the land and its people, who for a decade have marked my journey with wonder, enlightenment, and tears. Caucasus is all about history. Traveling through the region, and even through my own neighborhood, I have recognized how strongly politics are part of daily life, and how often history seems more important than the future. You might hear somebody tell you a story about something that happened in 12th century, not realizing he's recalling a recent event. My interest in trying to understand war and its long-term effects on people has guided most of my work. It is the region which, after Soviet Union fell apart, literally exploded with armed conflicts. Majority of them took place in Caucasus. However, I'm more curious about what motivated people to fight than in what they actually did. Civil war poisoned society completely, making lawlessness, self-destruction and brutality a part of daily life. It was like all those people who prided themselves on principles of hospitality and neighborliness just get up and went against those at some point. It left an internal split across the region that has never fully been addressed. I have crossed borders, felt their authority, and have heard too many stories about how they destroyed people's life. I believe there is an enormous space left for forgiveness if people are allowed to communicate without preconditions. I admit, though, I have no idea how such preconditions can be removed in the Caucasus, as it often is easier to believe what we want to believe or are told to believe. But if people could compare their own motives and actions to those of the others, their enemies, they would see then they are often the very same. However, borders are more and more ineffective against the World Wide Web, which is playing a greater role helping people reconnect. I met an Armenian refugee from Baku who lives in a former prison not far from Yerevan with a few other families. She told me that she reunited with her old Azeri friends from Baku through an internet site for classmates. Then she told me how one of the friends had died and she was invited to the funeral, but she couldn't go, she couldn't cross the border, and she cried. Georgia, where I continue to live, remains on the forefront of reforms among all countries of former Soviet Union and in the region. Things as simple as making Georgia border crossing transparent and modern in looks made Georgia neighbor to do the very same, as not to look too bad right there on the border. It is possibly most successful example of the society which transformed from chaotic post-Soviet nation to modern country, where absolute majority of people see themselves as a part of Europe and NATO despite of unthinkable hardships they experienced for last 20 years, and continuous pressure from its very strong and influential neighbor, Russia, which doesn't show the signs then it's ready to let the region go on its own path.
So after, maybe I'll open the other one, the other story. After I finished with this project, I was very tired of politics and I just wanted to do something completely away from politics, war and all those things. So I started doing a project with like women's stories around Soviet Union. But in the same time, I went to Crimea right after the war in Georgia, and I was in Crimea doing the story about like split, internal split. Some people wanted to be with Russia, some wanted to be very much with Ukraine. And back then, I had this idea of the story about Ukraine, the main river of Ukraine, the Dnipro, which historically, geographically divides country across different topics of history, Soviet recent one, geography, west and east, leaning to Russia or to Europe. But I was only able to complete this project in 2014 when I won the Aftermath War is only half of the story with this very the same proposal which I actually wrote in 2008. I went to Ukraine to write after war in Georgia, and I was in a congress of Russian-supported Cossacks. And there were people there on the stage talking about how they went to South Ossetia fight 2 months before. So for me it was just the connection was like right there in this happening, but had to wait. It took longer, I think, for the outside world to have a better look of what's going on there. So my Ukrainian project, when I started this, I didn't want to do, I'm sorry, it's my daughter, so I'm not sorry. Let me see, I'll just play it. Sorry, it's a quick tablet. Yes, so, when I started my project in Ukraine, when I started my project in Ukraine, I was thinking it's gonna be a story about history, geography, complicated splits and problems of the country. But the month I started this, the war broke out in the east part of the country. So the story, which was supposed to be just about the river, the strong undercurrent of armed conflict didn't took over, but become like a parallel line in this narrative, which which I was building in the river. So I followed around 10 people throughout more than 3 years, and as showing how, document how their life changed as the country was changing. Because there was a lot of people, there was a huge wave of civilians. It was almost like during the Spanish Civil War. It was not the war fought between the armies. It was like civilians, you know, dropped their life. You know, the hairdresser became a soldier, the doctor became the soldier, two women. You know, the lawyer became a soldier, the journalist became a volunteer. So it was really, really huge movements. I never seen anything like that in any other countries in a conflict moment. Then there was such a movement of the society to defend their country, essentially, or ideas they believe in. So there's a short summary I have in this about this from that project. So Smith Grant I received based on two previous projects which I showed you, and the idea for a proposal which I wrote for Smith came from many travels for the last 15 years around ex-Soviet Union, Caucasus and Ukraine. I met a lot of Russians, which were all very different, and they were different depending if the country was Kazakhstan or Latvia. I met Russians, you know, during the conflict in Ukraine, the ethnic Russians fighting on Ukrainian side. This conflict in many senses became, people start defining themselves more as a Ukrainian citizens, yes, ethnic Russians, but Ukrainian citizens, like Russians, which would tell me, I didn't care who I was before, you know, I didn't care, it was not the point for me, but war somehow made people to identify with the country, with the passport. And so idea of the project, there was a speech when Vladimir Putin had the speech after annexation of Crimea in 2014 in Moscow. He said then when Soviet Union fell apart, there was a situation when in the evening people went to the bed in one country, Soviet Union, and they woke up in 14 different countries next morning. And he said then Russian diaspora is one of the biggest diasporas in the world, divided by the borders. A lot of those conflicts had Russia influence. Russia was very strong presence in Ukraine. It was a war between Russia and Ukraine, very manufactured conflict about the language, which was not a problem in Ukraine. I mean, I spoke for 4 years Russian in Ukraine, and I have absolutely no problem. Language is not the issue. So a lot of those conflicts, I knew it from Caucasus before, because Caucasus in the beginning of 90s went through the wave of similar conflicts. So I knew the pattern, I knew how it's going to develop. And I remember when the war was starting in Ukraine, I was in the supermarket, and everybody was happy and joyful, and this woman selling was so happy, now we're going to be independent. And I just like, I just felt, I know the scenarios from before, how it happens. I've seen it before. And I just told her, like, what are you talking about? You're gonna have a war here, like real war in a month here, you know? It's like, it's not just like that. And I just remember I had this argument, like, but kind of like, I was not angry at her, I was just angry that she's so naive about this. And you just don't call an army or the soldiers and expect that it's gonna be peaceful. So, also because of that speech of President of Russia, I was thinking like, okay, this 20 million, over 20 million Russians live outside of Russia. They're all very different. They're very different. Nobody has a right to hijack, in a sense, the right to describe one nation as being such as another. We are all human beings. Doesn't matter we are Americans, Polish, or Russians, we are all different. And so I proposed this project about like documenting who are those Russians. Who are those Russian-speaking regions in Kazakhstan or in Latvia which were indicated as a next possible conflict after Ukraine? So I just wanted to document it. I will start with, it was the series of few stories done in the different countries. I will start with when before Soviet Union, that was the Russian Empire. So for more than 200 years, those areas are connected to Russia, mostly involuntarily, but also Russia is very present culturally there. During the Soviet time, the language, Russian language, became the language essentially of the career. In Soviet times, you had to write in the passport your ethnicity, your nationality. And a lot of people which were from mixed families, and it continues till today, they could have a family mix of Belarusian, Ukrainian, Polish, and Russians. They would put Russian to the passport because this was the language promoted as a language of the career, of the best universities, of the city, of the civilization. For example, Ukrainian language for a long time was considered was promoted as a peasant language. In 30s, during the purges, during Stalin time, when there were the first ethnic cleansing Stalin organized was against Poles, ethnic Poles living in Ukraine, a lot of people would write in their passport Russian because this way they can save their lives. And even today, when I travel to this Russian-speaking language, you know, and when I went in Latvia, for example, people from mixed families, and every single family I talk, it's very mixed because it's a classic Central European borderland, which was part of Poland, part of Belarus, part of Russia, now it's independent Latvia. So everybody is extremely, there's a huge Jewish population, which perished during the World War II. So everybody is extremely mixed, but still, in this Russian-speaking region, people would put in passport Russian. Because especially people who didn't integrate it, didn't learn Latvian language and use Russian. But, first story I propose, one of the smaller stories for Eugene Smith Grant, as about actual Russian from modern day Russia looking for political asylum in Ukraine. So this is a little bit of portrait-based story, and I will start with this man. He's a pensioner from Russia. He resettled to Ukraine. He crossed the border at night in a big snow. He was famous in Russia for one-man protest against Vladimir Putin. In Russia, it's legal. When you protest alone, that's legal. But at some point, you know, they start attaching like secret service, different policemen pretending that they joined them, and they will like take him to the jail because they said, you're not protesting alone anymore. So they're artificially adding people, you know, to put him to stop him doing this. At some point, he realized then he really, oh, I'm sorry, better you look at the picture. At some point, he realized that, okay, that's it. If now he's gonna go to jail, he for sure will go to prison. And he's pensioner, 71. And at night, he crossed, in the winter, it's a big snow, border from Russia to Ukraine, and his girlfriend came by train. So he received political asylum in Ukraine, has a UN passport. And he had like one of the best quotes, you know, about what is society and who are the people changing things. One woman said like, we cannot live together, one Russian woman in one of those anti-Ukrainian rallies, she said like in her speech, she was a local teacher, we cannot live together with them because we have a different history and different heroes. And a lot of those conflicts are based on different interpretation of Soviet past, like just very recent history. For example, famine. When I was in Crimea in 2008, there was a play about Stalin-era famine. Soviet interpretation is then, and present Russian interpretation is then this was the famine which equally, from which equally suffered Russian and all the other members of different republic. Ukrainian way of looking at this, was specifically targeting Ukrainian to eradicate the class of landowners which could potentially be a source of disagreement because lands were taken, people didn't like it. And very recently I've seen there's a Russian theater, there's a plays about famine as well. They start talking about, because the same thing happened essentially in Kazakhstan, so it was very interesting that it's in Russian theater, and as actors were performing, they were really emotional and crying. This is the rehearsal for this show about famine in Kazakhstan. It's also rewriting the Soviet history. You know, we know that taking Reichstag, it was very Slavic faces. But now Ukraine, Kazakhstan, all these new countries, they're saying like, wait a minute, you know, the winning of World War II, it's the winning of all of those nations living within the Soviet Union. So Kazakh, for example, you know, painted in the Museum of Military, they painted this mural where taking of the Reichstag during the World War II is done by the local face, we have a face of local World War II Kazakh hero. So there's a lot of this thing also going on, rewriting the history of Soviet Union, where there's a place for this other nation than just Russians. Latvia. Latvia is another country, it's a part of European Union and NATO. It's very different because, for example, in Kazakhstan, in one village, the man who just wrote in Facebook that he wants Kazakhstan, North Kazakhstan to join Russia, he got 5 year prison sentence. Because Latvia is a part of European and NATO, it's like the kind of respect for freedom of speech and different opinion is, it's like in Europe. So essentially, you know, there is a people there which just can come to TV, and then there's one guy which is active in politics, which says like, you know, Latvia is an artificial country, you know, Russia just should come and take over us, you know. So he can say it publicly in TV, in Kazakhstan, just for a Facebook post, the guy got 5 years. So, but because of that, because of the openness, essentially democracy being a much more delicate construction than the autocracy, then it's harder to deal with certain issues. Because autocrats just put things to prison, and in a European country or in America you have to sort it out a different way. So I went to the region which, Latgalia, which right after the war with Ukraine, BBC had this documentary, fictitious documentary about the World War III, which took place in this region, which is a very Russian-speaking region on the border with, there was BBC had the program Global Voices dedicated to the Russia and Latvia and Baltic states, the whole conversation about possibility of new conflict there. So, but when I wrote to the Ministry of Defense of Latvia asking if I can photograph arriving Canadian soldiers for my story about Russia relation with Baltic states, they wrote me that they don't see any connection. So again, it's one of those, it's the region I was talking about, very mixed, which was part of different countries throughout the history. And what I learned with this project, those Russian-speaking regions this is not like regions where Russians live. It's usually all different kind of nations, which may be, or regions which didn't integrate into the country, like the Russian is still being used instead of main language of the country, like in Latvia. This is actually an American boy from New York. He's from New York. There's a school in this region which is called Learn Russian in EU, because there's a lot of people working in NATO, very high-profile people just come to study Russian there because they don't need visa, and this is the Russian-speaking region. So. And there is also a story about indigenous Russian. There was a religious group, old believers, which lived there. After Latvia get independence from Soviet Union, they didn't give passport to people who moved there after the World War II, which were Russian. Only Russians which were born there before, on the beginning of century, could get the passports. Those lived there for 200 and 300 years, old believers, and then and again, there's I don't know how much time we have, but there's another case of Russia being with its neighbors, influencing the neighbors, changing their place. Passportization. Like Abkhazia and Ossetia are the places which had broke away from Georgia in the beginning of 90s. And during the time Georgia didn't control it, a lot of people obtained Russian passports. It's called passportization. And then afterwards, Russia was using this as a pretext to invade, use the army, because they were protecting their own citizens. So it was, in a sense, manufacturing. But each of the stories is very complex. Here, the key for this story is a religion, because Abkhaz are both Muslim and Christian, and among Christian church, there's like a rebel church. Essentially, there is a younger priest hijack the part of the churches from older priests, and one of them see Moscow as their destination, and the other Constantinople. They want to go back to the roots. This is from the museum dedicated to men who died during the war in '93, and I thought it's like really crazy, you know, that this is only belonging of the men which died, like the comb, the hair, and sunglasses. This, when I think of those early war in '90s, it was the same in Balkans. It was just so crazy, so like chaotic. There was no armies. It was just men, you know, in this kind of bravado. Okay, we're going to join the war. This is the Stalin Museum. Stalin used to sleep on this kind of bed. He never slept in a normal bed. He slept on this kind of chaiselong, I don't know how to call it. And this is the little story, you know, with this project, you know, Smith, this kind of grant allows me to look like very wide at a certain place. But now, since I'm coming down back on the ground, and then I have, because it's like so little is written about these places, then my work is also research. I'm finding stories as I go. So for example, this is the story. I will continue to do a smaller story within that story about Syrians, which are ethnic Abkhaz, and returned, they were escaping Abkhazia and settled in Abkhazia. The funny thing is, no, sorry, not the funny. The ironic thing is then, when they're escaping in 19th century Abkhazia, they're escaping from Russians, which won the war with Turkey. And now, they're kind of returning with the help of for Russian-controlled region to their motherland. So there's a certain irony. And they're the ones which know Abkhaz, the language, while people on the ground become Orthodox Christian and they speak mostly Russian. There's a lot of kind of historical twist to this I would like to explore additionally. Yeah, and this is the last picture, maybe. Let me see what I have there. I will finish with this picture. This is the picture, one picture taken in Georgia, you know, kind of on the Georgian territory, because as I said, in Caucasus, things are very much about the politics. In the ex-Soviet Union, things are very much about interpretation of history, recent history. This is the rugby match of Georgia and Ukraine. After Georgia and Ukraine had the war with Russia, they had both probably the two strongest rugby teams in the ex-Soviet Union. It's really strong. The Georgian is actually stronger, you know, it's really funny. And Georgia is a very small nation, so for them every rugby match with Russia is like a political event. And I remember, I know the documentary filmmaker, right after the war, when there was the next time they had to play the game, they couldn't play it in Russia or Ukraine, Georgia, because their relations were broken, so they were flying to Ukraine. And actually the Georgian players in the airplane flying to the match with Russia, my friend told me they're looking at the screens, images of the war like, a couple months ago, which happened in South Ossetia, you know, the destruction of like Georgians running. So again, going back to this point, you know, how this conflict are very connected to everyday life. It's not something, you know, which happen and people forget. Yeah, I guess I don't know if I say enough. Maybe you have a question.
Does anybody have any questions? You can raise your hand and I'll pass the mic.
So, where do you consider your home now? Or are you...
New York, of course. No, my home is like, yeah, I think Tbilisi, Georgia, it's my main home now, yeah.
And do you feel emotionally bonded to it? Or is it a place where you're
I feel
located?
You know, I feel emotionally attached to, I kind of think I have two homelands, Poland and Georgia, you know. I lived there 15 years. I found finally a person which can print the nice photographs for me. Yeah, I definitely feel, it's like you cannot feel not attached to the place, which is not easy to live, being in the same time amazing place to live. Which, in a sense, I experienced this so much, which I had no chance to experience in Poland. In Poland, I'm from the village. All the major historical changes happened, you know, when I was like in a primary school, so I couldn't take part in this. So in Georgia, I had the chance to experience really firsthand, essentially, Rose Revolution, war, major historical events, and I think this experience is very valuable for me.
Your passport says Russian?
No, my passport says Polish, but you know, even doing this project was very weird, because just imagine that I come to, will be the same like I come to New York and start coming up to people asking them, who are you, what's your nationality, you know? People, because it's like people, you know, in time of peace they don't think about this, but in a time of conflict it's being used as a weapon, you know? So I was just like, I go to Latvia region, I drove the car and I start going around asking people, who are you? You know, it's like I'm amazed how many people have a Polish ancestors across the huge territory. So, yeah, I'm just, you know, like I'm walking around like a child, asking people, who are you? What's your nationality? And some people think it's very weird, but there's the only way to get to the bottom of this.
Justyna, do you see this as your life work, or do you see this as a project that will come to an end at a specific time?
You know, I see this as a third chapter of bigger novel, let's say, like saga about ex-Soviet Union. So this year I'm gonna, I put Ukrainian project book aside to work, to produce this body of work, to put a good dent in this third chapter of work on ex-Soviet Union with Smith Grant. Now I'm gonna put this a little bit aside, and I will focus on having my Ukrainian work published, because I think if I wait longer, it's gonna kinda lose its moment. And then I plan to continue with what I did with Eugene Smith, but I will move to Europe, because I think the issue of Russia influence and Russia being in the world went well beyond the border of ex-Soviet Union. It's a very big issue in Europe, also in America, but again, you know, my idea, my main aim of this project is to show that a Russian person is not like one cliche made of paper. They are all very different, and I think in this kind of heated discussion, we're really missing this. And yeah, I would like to focus on one hand, showing this region which potentially, and why, explain why, document why they could become like some kind of flashpoints of potential conflict, but also profile different people, their different choices in life, and the Russians in all their variety.
Hi, I just want to thank you first for a really thoughtful and sensitive photography. It was beautiful. And I wanted to ask you, since there are some people who struggle with how to put together a project, you know, there's many stages to this sort of thing, photography, technical, and so forth. And I wondered if you could review a little bit of what that process might have been, even, you know, when I'm looking at something like this, the way it's edited or how it's put together, or the help, the support that you get to do some of that part of it. Because obviously the presentation is so much an important part and strength of the story.
So essentially, you know, since I'm working as a photographer 15 years, and there's always two parallel lines in my work. I like to call myself a documentary photographer, because not the photojournalist. It's my preferred way to describe, because documentary photography, there is a less urgency. There is a more space of search, research, even changing the way of thinking about things along the way. So it's a longer process where story could change, I can change. In photojournalism, so there is implemented some sense of urgency. Then this is something quick delivery, something produced, it's being published, you move on. So that's why I prefer to call myself a documentary photographer, because my long-term projects were always the most important part of my work. Those projects kept me going, but actually, a lot of the images you see are picked up from smaller assignments, doing photojournalism. Because I love to do photojournalism. In a sense, it's relatively easy. You have a topic, you have a very often hero, I never illustrated, you know. I work with good editors, and I'm also pretty stubborn, so I just did what I want anyway. I just try to do the best I can when I'm doing assignments. So, yeah, like working in the region Caucasus, a lot of stories which you see in the first video from Caucasus were picked up, 1 or 2 photos from assignments I did. So I essentially didn't change the way I look at things if I do documentary and photojournalism. The only thing is, like, you know, in documentary you have to sometimes invest your own time, because some stories are, you just cannot attach the proper news tag, they're not interesting. I don't think without Smith I would have a chance to produce many of those stories I showed here, because it's kind of like they don't have a concrete news tag, you know? It's like, when I always say, when you do a story about refugees in Europe, whatever story, or Filipino drug wars, whatever story you do from this country, they set in a context which in the time as people know this context. When I'm doing a story about Russians in North Kazakhstan, or the church rebel split, 2 church fighting for souls in Abkhazia, which is, it's like the context is like, just to explain the context takes half of the story. You know, so in this sense, those stories are harder to pitch, and in this sense, Grant, like Smith, are like really amazing, allowed me But before Smith, before Aftermath, I really was like working. I never give up. You know, I cry 3 days, get up, do the story. So it's a really mixed model. Sometimes I produce the story, sometimes I get the guarantee just to do a story and I sell it a year later, sometimes too. So it's a very kind of mixed business model, if you can call it. But definitely, you know, personal project, it's something I think if anybody is serious about photography, it's a thing which should be done. And I guarantee you that when you have a breakdown because assignment will not come, you have no money, your own project, if you be passionate about this and you continue doing this, this project will help you to stay, I don't know, positive, keep on working, you know? It's like a big engine which will drive you forward. Because if you just leave from one assignment to another, there's such an empty space between that. Empty space could become a very huge gap. And then you're lost. If you have your project, it's like your baby, you can go on and pat it and take care of this and you cut the hair and dress it, you know, add the elements. That's the safety, safety zone. But, yeah.
The later part is this, for the Smith Award.
Yeah.
Because it's all color, I think, and it seems to be like a square format. And I guess I do imagine when you're with these people, it's almost as though you're invisible. And so it does interest me how you achieve that. You have some ideas about, you know, because I'm sure that's something that you strive to do. And it seems like your presence seems very accepted in any of these situations. I don't feel...
I don't know. I think I'm just very, very curious about people. And really, it's like, I almost sometimes think that photography is a pure product of my actual curiosity about stories and people. I never lie to people, I never make promises to people. I'm really, most of the time saying, you know, here I am, doing the story. Like, there's one woman in Latvian project. She was, I just went to a hairdresser to wash my hair. And then, you know, she was washing my hair, we were talking, and then she told me her story about how her nephew took the kid to England, and they were like, living bad life there, and the kid was taken away, and she decided to put this woman from the village, not speaking the word of English, to put this fight, to go to England, to get the child back. And she did. And then as she was washing my hair, we were talking, she was telling me the story, and I asked her, like, would you mind if I'll come to photograph you? You know, I think it's a very interesting story, it's, you know, and then she said, I have to talk to my husband. We have to have a family meeting, and then she called me and she said yes. So very often, you know, sometimes I find people in a serious, you know, articles about like there's some activist or something, but I also find people in a very random situation. I was in Ukraine, I was in a bus in Mariupol, and I've seen this priest with the Ukrainian flag, little Ukrainian flag in his jacket. In a time when nobody was doing this, because it was like very kind of pro-Russian ready. It was one of those kind of iffy places. And I was just curious, it's like, who is he doing this, you know? And he was with wife and the kid, and I just in the bus come to him and ask, who is he? And he became also one of the people I photographed. So I guess, yeah, it's just kind of the basic curiosity about people, you know? It was really funny when I took my daughter in one of the Ukrainian trips, and then, you know, at first she was going through the face, being really shy, hiding behind me. And at the end of the trip, she told me, like, Mom, it's really amazing. So, no, it was like this. We're walking in the street. She said, like, who is this woman? Can you just come up to her and ask? She totally got it, you know? So, like, I think photography is really amazing tool, a key opening many doors. Literally, you know, if you don't lie, you don't make promises to people. Like, you know, I think people are like, I guess, you know, joke with them. I like to joke, you know. Joke is a good thing. Yes?
So you mentioned a couple of the people had uncertain immigration statuses and, you know, were on the margins. Is there anyone you didn't include in your project, your presentation, to protect them?
No, it's fine, you know, I never show pictures, you know, which could somehow put people in a difficult situation. No, no, no. It's like, it's clear. This is the part of what I was saying. I don't lie to people. I don't come to people saying I'm a hobby photographer or I like to collect flowers. I'm saying I'm working on a book project or I'm working on something which can be published, you know? And most of my videos, all my interviews, I recorded interviews with a lot of these people. It's on a video. Yeah, so it's like, and I'm close. I don't use the long lens. My lens is, it's impossible not to notice me that I'm taking photograph because it's like no more than, I don't use lens higher than 50, really.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean like to suggest that you were trapping them, but do you ever worry about their safety?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I would never, I think the whole talk about the photographers being not sensitive to people suffering, you know, they'll choose the photograph over saving somebody's life. It's like the most stupid thing I ever heard. You know, I don't know where this kind of cliche essentially came from. I have no idea. You know, most of the photographers I know, including myself, I'm sure then, you know, they would not sacrifice a life for a picture, you know. And if they do, very short legs. They don't wanna go far in this profession, I think. They better start selling used cars.